The last confirmed sighting of Marlene Voss came at 6:42 on a Thursday morning in October 1988. She was supposed to be driving 8 miles east of town, heading toward the textile plant where she worked. She never arrived. Her blue Chevrolet Nova was found that afternoon in the parking lot of a closed roadside diner outside Meadville, Pennsylvania. The driver's door was locked. Her purse was underneath the passenger seat. Her lunch was still inside the car. What investigators could not explain was why Marlene had driven 12 miles in the opposite direction. At the time, nobody considered that detail especially important. 31 years later, her son would find something behind a wall in the house where Marlene had lived. It was a letter. And the date written across the top was 3 days before she disappeared. For most of Marlene's family, the morning she vanished had always been painfully ordinary. She was 37 years old, raising 2 children on her own after separating from her husband several years earlier. Her son Wade was 13. Her daughter Colleen was 9. Marlene worked early shifts because they paid slightly more, and she had developed the kind of routine that made her movements easy to predict. She woke at 5:10. She made coffee. She packed lunches. She left the house shortly after 6. That Thursday was no different. Wade remembered hearing his mother's kitchen cabinet close before he went back to sleep. Colleen later remembered something else. Her mother had stood in the hallway for several seconds, looking toward the front door. She didn't know why. She only remembered that Marlene seemed distracted. At 6:18, a neighbor named Orville Pritchard saw Marlene leave the driveway. That would become the last confirmed sighting of her alive. At 7:03, her supervisor called the house. Marlene had not shown up for work. That alone was unusual. She had missed 1 shift in the previous 6 years, and that had been because Wade was sick. Her supervisor waited another hour before calling again. Nobody answered. By noon, Marlene's sister, Darlene, was driving around town looking for her. She checked the plant. She checked the grocery store. She drove past the school. Then, shortly after 2 in the afternoon, a county dispatcher received a call about an abandoned vehicle. The car belonged to Marlene. It was parked beside the old Pine Ridge Diner, a business that had closed almost a year earlier. The building was empty. The windows were covered with plywood. There was no reason for Marlene to be there. Inside the Nova, investigators found her purse, driver's license, wallet, makeup, and a paperback novel she had been reading. Her keys were not in the ignition. They were on the floor beneath the driver's seat. That detail bothered one investigator immediately. If Marlene had simply stopped somewhere, why would she have locked the car and left the keys inside? There was another problem. The diner was not on her normal route to work. It wasn't even close. The detour added nearly 20 minutes to her drive. Police initially assumed she had gone there to meet someone. But nobody came forward. And when investigators checked the diner, they found no obvious sign that anyone had recently been inside. The case began with a simple question. Why had Marlene driven there? Within 2 days, investigators had several possible answers. None of them fit. One coworker said Marlene had seemed nervous during the week before she disappeared. Another said she had been completely normal. Her sister insisted Marlene had been planning a weekend trip with the children. Her separated husband said she had been considering moving. Marlene's landlord said she had recently asked whether anyone had been entering the basement. Each detail seemed unrelated. Then investigators discovered something that made the timeline more confusing. On the evening before Marlene disappeared, she had withdrawn $180 from her bank account. She normally carried very little cash. And according to her sister, Marlene had been saving money for a new washing machine. The withdrawal could have meant nothing. But the following morning, none of that cash was found in her purse. Investigators asked where it had gone. There was no answer. The case remained open through the winter. Search teams checked the roads surrounding the diner. Volunteers walked sections of nearby farmland. Police questioned co-workers, neighbors, relatives, and several men Marlene had known socially. Nothing established where she had gone after leaving the diner. Then, in January 1989, someone remembered a detail that had been overlooked. A mechanic at a garage less than a mile from the diner said he had seen Marlene's Nova that morning. But he remembered the car being there before 7. That was a problem. According to the original timeline, Marlene should not have reached the diner until sometime after 6:45. The mechanic was certain about the time because he had been opening the garage for the morning shift. He also remembered something else. Marlene's car had not been alone. There had been another vehicle parked behind it. A dark-colored station wagon. He couldn't remember the make. He couldn't remember the license plate. But he remembered the driver. It was a man standing beside the rear door. And according to the mechanic, the man was not looking toward the diner. He was watching Marlene's car. The police interviewed him again. By then, however, more than 3 months had passed. The mechanic hesitated. Then he admitted he had never actually seen the man's face. He had only seen the back of his head and the side of his jacket. The lead went nowhere. For Wade, the disappearance became something he learned to live around. He grew up without knowing whether his mother had left voluntarily, whether someone had convinced her to leave, or whether she had simply disappeared into circumstances nobody understood. The house eventually changed. Furniture was sold. Rooms were repainted. The children grew older. Marlene's name appeared less often in conversation. But one room was rarely touched. Her old sewing room remained mostly as she had left it. A wooden desk stood against the wall. A narrow bookshelf sat beside the window. And behind the desk was a section of plaster that had always looked slightly different from the rest. Nobody paid attention to it. Not until 2019. Wade was 44 by then. He had returned to the house after his aunt decided to sell it. While helping clear out the remaining furniture, he moved the old desk away from the wall. Something fell behind it. It wasn't the letter. It was a small piece of yellowed wallpaper. Underneath it was a narrow crack in the plaster. Wade assumed it was damage from age. Then he noticed something inside the opening. A folded sheet of paper. It had been pushed deep into the wall. And when Wade pulled it free, he recognized his mother's handwriting immediately. The first line read, "If you're reading this, I didn't have time to tell you." Wade stopped there. Because beneath that sentence was a date. October 10, 1988. 3 days before Marlene disappeared. Wade read the sentence twice. Then he turned the page over, expecting to find more writing on the back. There was nothing. The letter had been folded several times, and the creases were so deep that part of the paper had begun to split. He carried it into the kitchen and placed it beneath the light. The handwriting continued on the second page. Marlene had written only 6 lines. The first said that someone had been inside the house. The second said she had not told the children. The third mentioned a name Wade did not recognize. Then the handwriting changed. The letters became smaller, tighter, as though Marlene had been trying to fit more words onto the page. She wrote that she had found something in the basement. She did not explain what it was. Instead, she wrote one sentence that made Wade put the paper down. "If I leave, don't let them sell the house." Wade stared at the sentence. For several seconds he didn't move. Then he picked up the letter again and looked at the date. October 10th. 3 days before his mother disappeared. He knew the house had been sold once before. His aunt had mentioned it years earlier. But nobody had ever told him that Marlene had specifically warned against it. Wade searched through the remaining boxes that afternoon. Most contained ordinary things. Tax documents. School records. Old utility bills. Christmas decorations. Then he found a folder marked with his mother's handwriting. It contained copies of property records from 1987. The house wasn't the only property listed. There was another address. A small parcel of land about 14 miles outside Meadville. Wade had never heard of it. The deed showed that Marlene had purchased the property 6 months before she disappeared. She had paid in cash. There was no mortgage. And the name of the seller was the same name Marlene had written in the letter. Wade stopped reading. He went back to the kitchen and placed the letter beside the deed. For the first time the name looked familiar. Not because he remembered the man. Because he remembered hearing his mother say the name when he was a child. She had said it once. In the kitchen. Late at night. Wade couldn't remember the conversation, but he remembered his mother's voice becoming quiet afterward. That memory had never seemed important. Now it wouldn't leave him alone. The next morning, Wade drove to the address on the deed. The road narrowed after the last row of houses. Eventually the pavement disappeared. The property was mostly wooded, with an old access road leading toward a clearing. There was no house. No barn. Nothing marked the boundary. But someone had recently replaced the mailbox. Wade pulled over. The metal box was almost new. And inside it was a folded piece of paper. There was no name on the outside. Only 4 numbers. October 13th, 88. Wade's hand stopped moving. October 13th. The day Marlene disappeared. He opened the paper. Inside was a photocopy of a handwritten property survey. One section had been circled in pencil. At the bottom was a note. Ask why she paid twice. Wade read it again. Then he noticed the photocopy had been made recently. The paper was clean. The handwriting wasn't. It was the same handwriting he had just seen on his mother's letter. But the note wasn't written in 1988. Someone had added it much later. And someone had known exactly where Wade would look. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story. Wade folded the photocopy and put it in his jacket. He didn't drive home. Instead, he went to the county records office and asked to see the original deed for the property. The clerk brought out a thin file. There were 2 purchase records. The first was dated April 1988. The second was dated September 1988. Both listed Marlene as the buyer. Wade stared at the amounts. The September payment was almost exactly the same as the April payment. He asked the clerk why there were 2 transactions. She checked the records again. Then she frowned. That's unusual. The second transaction wasn't a second purchase. It was a correction. Someone had changed the legal description of the property. A section of land had been removed. Wade asked who had requested the correction. The clerk searched through the attached paperwork. There was no request form. No signature. No explanation. Only a stamped date. October 11, 1988. 2 days before Marlene disappeared. Wade felt his jaw tighten. He asked for the original survey. The clerk returned several minutes later with a large folded sheet. One corner had been torn away. The missing section was exactly where the correction had been made. Wade took photographs of everything. Before leaving, he noticed a handwritten notation in the margin. It wasn't part of the official record. Someone had written, "See File 44B." The clerk didn't recognize the notation. But when Wade asked what File 44B was, she stopped typing. She looked toward the back office. Then she lowered her voice. That file shouldn't still exist. Wade waited. The clerk disappeared through a door. She returned carrying a gray cardboard folder covered in dust. There was no computer record for it. Inside were documents from 1988 involving several properties in the same area. Most were routine. Tax notices. Boundary disputes. Old survey maps. Then Wade found a page with Marlene's signature. It wasn't a property document. It was a receipt. The date was October 11th. The amount was $900. The recipient's name had been blacked out. But the address underneath was still visible. It belonged to a building that had been demolished 20 years earlier. A small machine shop on the edge of town. Wade knew the location. His mother used to drive past it every morning. Then he noticed the receipt had a second line beneath the amount. Read, "Final payment received." Wade looked at the clerk. She was already staring at him. Neither of them spoke. The next morning, Wade called a retired investigator who had worked on Marlene's disappearance in the late 1980s. His name was Everett Gannon. Everett listened without interrupting. When Wade mentioned the property, there was a long pause. Then Everett asked him one question. "Where did you get that receipt?" Wade told him. Everett didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked Wade whether he still had the letter. Wade said yes. Everett's breathing changed. He told Wade not to photograph it, not to mail it, and not to show it to anyone else. Then Everett said something Wade hadn't expected. The police had searched Marlene's house 3 times in 1988. The wall behind the sewing desk had been opened during the 3rd search. There had been nothing inside. Wade looked toward the room. The letter was still sitting on his kitchen table. He asked Everett what else had been behind that wall. Everett went silent. Then he said he remembered seeing a second envelope. And according to his notes, it had been removed before the search was finished. He never knew who took it. Wade wrote down Everett's number and asked him to repeat the last part. Everett refused. He said he wanted to see the letter before discussing anything else. They agreed to meet that afternoon at a diner outside town. Wade arrived first. He placed the letter inside a manila envelope and kept it beside him on the booth. Everett arrived 10 minutes later carrying a worn leather folder. He looked older than Wade expected. His hands shook slightly when he removed his glasses. He didn't touch the envelope. Instead, he asked Wade whether anyone else knew about it. Wade said no. Everett opened his folder. Inside was a photocopy of a handwritten search log from October 1988. One entry had been circled. October 18th, sewing room wall opened. Underneath it was another line. Envelope recovered. Contents not logged. Wade leaned closer. He asked why the original report didn't mention an envelope. Everett looked down at the table. Because someone changed the report. He turned another page. The original search log had been typed. A later copy had been retyped by hand. One sentence was missing. Everett had kept the older photocopy because he had noticed the discrepancy years later. Wade asked who had access to the records. Everett gave him 3 names. One was a deputy. One was a county clerk. The third name belonged to a private investigator who had briefly worked with Marlene's family. Wade recognized the third name. It was the same name written on the property receipt. The man Marlene had paid $900. Everett watched Wade's expression change. He asked whether Wade knew what the man had been doing for Marlene. Wade didn't. Everett said he had never been able to establish that either. But there was one thing in his old notes that had bothered him for 31 years. Marlene had hired the investigator 11 days before she disappeared. She paid him twice. The first payment was $400. The second was $900. Everett had assumed the larger payment was for locating someone. He had never found out who. Wade asked whether the investigator was still alive. Everett nodded. Then he gave Wade an address. It was less than 5 miles from the property. Wade drove there before sunset. The house was smaller than he expected. A single porch light was on. An elderly man answered the door. His name was Lester Vale. Wade introduced himself. The man's face changed immediately. He didn't ask which Wade. He simply stepped backward. Then he said, "You shouldn't have that letter." Wade hadn't told him about the letter. For several seconds neither man moved. Lester finally opened the door wider. He told Wade to come inside. The living room was crowded with filing cabinets, old newspapers and cardboard boxes. Lester pointed toward a chair. Then he asked one question. "Did Everett send you?" Wade said yes. Lester closed his eyes. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table. He told Wade that Marlene had come to him because she believed someone was watching her house. She didn't know who. She only knew that small things were changing. A kitchen drawer would be left open. A light she had switched off would be on. Mail would disappear and return several days later. Lester said he had dismissed most of it. Until Marlene showed him something. A property map. It wasn't the map Wade had found. It was another one. Marlene had marked 3 locations with pencil. The house, the machine shop, and the property she had purchased outside town. Lester said the 3 points formed a straight line. Then he stopped. Wade asked what was at the end of that line. Lester looked toward one of the filing cabinets. "I never found out." He opened the drawer. Inside was a stack of folders. He pulled out a thin brown envelope. There was no label. But when he turned it over, Wade saw a date written in pencil. October 12, 1988. One day before Marlene disappeared. Lester placed the envelope on the table. He didn't open it. Instead, he asked Wade whether he wanted to know what Marlene had asked him to do the night before she vanished. Wade nodded. Lester's hand remained on the envelope. "She wanted me to follow her." Then he looked toward the window. "And I did." He paused. "I followed her to the machine shop." Wade felt his fingers go cold. Lester finally opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the machine shop from across the road. The timestamp on the back read 11:26 p.m. And parked beside the building was Marlene's blue Chevrolet Nova. But there was another vehicle in the photograph. A dark station wagon. The same one the mechanic had described. And someone was standing beside it. Lester had written one sentence beneath the photograph. "I recognize the driver." Lester kept his finger over the sentence. Wade asked who the driver was. Lester didn't answer. Instead, he turned the photograph over. On the back was a second note. "Do not give this to the police." Wade looked up. He asked why. Lester said he had intended to hand it over the next morning. But Marlene never came back. And by the time Lester contacted the investigator handling the case, the machine shop had already been searched. The photograph was never mentioned. Neither was Lester's presence outside the building that night. Wade asked what happened after the photograph was taken. Lester said he stayed across the road until 12:14. At that point, another vehicle arrived. A pickup truck. The driver entered the machine shop. 20 minutes later, the station wagon left. Marlene's Nova remained there. Lester said he waited another 10 minutes before driving away. He never saw Marlene leave. Wade asked why he hadn't told police about the pickup. Lester's mouth tightened. Because the pickup belonged to someone connected to the investigation. Wade asked who. Lester finally gave him the name. It was a county employee. A man who had signed the original search paperwork for Marlene's house. Wade felt his stomach tighten. He asked whether the man had known Marlene. Lester said yes, but not socially. He had handled the property correction filed 2 days before Marlene disappeared. The same correction that removed part of the land from her deed. Wade looked back at the photograph. The machine shop sat dark behind the station wagon. But there was one detail he hadn't noticed before. A narrow rectangle of light was visible beneath the side door. Someone had been inside. Lester noticed it too. He leaned closer. Then his expression changed. He reached for a magnifying glass from the desk. The light wasn't coming from inside the shop. It was coming from underneath the building. Wade looked at him. Lester said nothing. He opened another drawer and removed a folded map. This one showed the property beneath the machine shop. There was an underground service tunnel running beneath the building. It had been used decades earlier for utility access. The tunnel connected to an old drainage line. And that line ended near the property Marlene had purchased. Wade asked why Marlene would know about it. Lester shook his head. She didn't. He unfolded the map completely. Someone had marked the tunnel in red pencil. The mark was recent. Lester had not drawn it. Wade asked who had. Lester said he didn't know. Then he pointed to a small handwritten date beside the mark. October 13, 1988. The day Marlene disappeared. Wade's phone vibrated on the table. The number was blocked. He answered. Nobody spoke. Then he heard a faint clicking sound. 3 clicks. Pause. Then 3 more. The call ended. Wade looked at Lester. Lester's face had gone pale. He asked Wade whether that number had ever called him before. Wade said no. Lester stared at the phone. Then he quietly said that Marlene had received the same kind of call the night before she disappeared. She had described the clicking to him. She believed it was someone trying to tell her something. Lester had assumed she was mistaken. Until that moment. Wade looked at the photograph again. There was something written in the lower corner. He had missed it because the ink was almost faded. A single word. Basement. Lester saw it. His hand immediately moved toward the photograph. But Wade pulled it away. Then someone knocked on the front door. Neither man moved. The knock came again. 3 slow taps. Lester looked toward the hallway. Then he whispered, "Stay here." He walked to the front door without turning on another light. Wade watched him look through the narrow glass panel. His shoulders stiffened. He stepped away from the door. Nobody was standing on the porch. Lester waited several seconds before unlocking it. The porch was empty. But something had been left on the bottom step. A small brown envelope. Lester picked it up. There was no stamp. No address. Only Wade's first name written across the front. Wade felt his hands tighten. Lester brought it inside and placed it on the table. He didn't open it. Wade asked how anyone could have known he was there. Lester looked at the clock. They had been inside for less than 40 minutes. Then he noticed something else. The front window was slightly open. Lester always kept it locked. He checked the frame. There were fresh scratches around the latch. Someone had tried to open it from outside. Wade looked back at the envelope. He asked Lester if he had a phone in the house. Lester said yes. Wade told him to call the police. Lester reached for the telephone. Then stopped. A thin strip of white paper had been pushed underneath the phone. It hadn't been there when Wade arrived. Lester pulled it free. There were only 4 words. "Don't open the envelope." Wade stared at the message. Lester turned the paper over. Nothing. Then Wade noticed the handwriting. The letters were narrow and slightly tilted. He had seen that handwriting before. It matched the note on the property survey. But it did not match Marlene's handwriting. Lester finally opened the envelope. Inside was a photocopy of an old employment record. The name at the top belonged to the county employee who had signed Marlene's property correction. His employment began in 1986. His listed position was records clerk. But beneath his name was another document. A payroll adjustment. For October 1988. It showed that he had been paid for work on October 13th. The problem was the location. He had been assigned to a county office 40 miles away. Wade looked at Lester. Then why was he at the machine shop? Lester didn't answer. He turned the document over. Someone had written a second location on the back. A location Wade recognized. It was the address of Marlene's house. And beside it was a time. 2:17 a.m. Wade's eyes stayed on the number. Marlene had disappeared less than 4 hours later. Lester reached for the old map again. This time he unfolded it across the entire table. The machine shop. Marlene's property. Her house. 3 locations. 3 lines had been drawn between them. The lines formed a rough triangle. At the center was a 4th location. Wade had never heard of it. Lester had. He pointed to the mark. That used to be a pumping station. Wade asked what happened to it. Lester said the county demolished it in 1984. Then he looked closer at the map. A small pencil mark had been added beside the station. The date was newer. October 12, 1988. The day before Marlene disappeared. Lester reached for his coat. Wade asked where he was going. Lester said he wanted to check something before calling anyone. He grabbed a flashlight from the hallway. Then Wade noticed a folded newspaper sitting beneath it. The paper was from October 14, 1988, the day after Marlene disappeared. One article had been circled. It wasn't about Marlene. It was about a maintenance worker who had reported an unexplained electrical outage at the old pumping station. The outage occurred at exactly 2:17 a.m. Lester looked at Wade. Neither of them spoke. Then Wade noticed the article continued onto another page. And at the bottom was a photograph. The photograph showed the pumping station. Standing beside the entrance was a man Wade recognized. Not from the photograph of the machine shop. From somewhere else. From an old family picture his mother had kept in the sewing room. And suddenly Wade understood why Marlene had never wanted that photograph found. Wade didn't touch the newspaper. He asked Lester who the man was. Lester kept staring at the photograph. Then he said, "That's the part one never told the police." Wade stepped closer. The image was grainy, but the man's face was visible enough to recognize. It was Harold Venn, Marlene's former brother-in-law. He had been married to Marlene's older sister for 11 years. And according to the family, he had moved to Ohio in 1986. Wade remembered that story. His mother had repeated it more than once. Harold had taken a job near Toledo. He had supposedly left Pennsylvania permanently. But the newspaper photograph had been taken 2 years later. At the old pumping station. Lester folded the newspaper. He said Harold wasn't the only person in the photograph. There was another man standing behind him. Only part of his face was visible. Lester took the magnifying glass again. His fingers trembled as he moved it across the image. Then he stopped. The second man was the county records clerk. The same man who had signed the property correction. Wade felt a tightness in his chest. He asked Lester why two men connected to Marlene were standing together at a place that had supposedly been abandoned for years. Lester said he didn't know. Then he added something worse. The pumping station wasn't abandoned that night. Someone had been using it. Lester had learned that from a maintenance log. The log disappeared from the county records the week after Marlene vanished. But one photocopy remained. He pulled it from another folder. There were only 3 entries for October. The last one was dated October 13th. Beside it was a handwritten notation. Inspection requested by MV. Wade stared at the initials. Marlene had requested the inspection. But nobody had ever mentioned it during the original investigation. Lester said he had found the log 6 years after the disappearance. By then, the county office had already changed its filing system. He tried asking questions. Nobody wanted to discuss it. Then one person gave him a warning. Lester refused to say who. Wade asked why he had kept all of this for 31 years. Lester looked toward the window. Because I thought somebody would eventually come looking for it. Wade asked whether anyone had. Lester nodded. What? In 1997. A man had come to his office asking about the pumping station. He knew about the missing maintenance log. He knew about Marlene. And he knew Lester had taken photographs that night. Lester said he had denied everything. The man left without arguing. 2 days later, Lester's office was broken into. Nothing valuable was taken. Only one file disappeared. The file contained his notes about Marlene. Wade asked if the man had a name. Lester reached into the folder. He pulled out an old business card. The edges had turned brown. The name printed on it was Calvin Rusk. Wade didn't recognize it. But beneath the name was a company address. Wade took out his phone and searched the address. The business no longer existed. The building did. It had been converted into a self-storage facility. Wade looked at Lester. Do you think the files are still there? Lester shook his head. I don't think the files are what you're looking for. He turned the business card over. There was writing on the back. A date, a time, and a room number. October 13, 1988, 11:40 p.m., room 17. Wade stared at it. The date was the night Marlene disappeared. The time was less than 20 minutes after Lester had taken the photograph outside the machine shop. But there was one problem. The storage building hadn't been a storage facility in 1988. It had been the machine shop. Wade looked at the old photograph again. Then he noticed something in the background that he hadn't seen before. A small metal door. The number painted above it was barely visible. 17. Lester slowly lowered the photograph. That door wasn't on the building plans. Then Wade's phone vibrated again. This time the caller ID showed a number. Not blocked. It was a number Wade recognized. It belonged to the county records office. He answered. A woman's voice said his name. Then she asked whether he still had the letter. Before Wade could respond, she said something else. Because someone just requested the original file. The call ended. A second later, another message appeared on Wade's phone. It contained a single photograph. The image showed the wall behind his mother's old sewing desk. Someone had photographed it that afternoon. And beneath the photograph was one sentence. "You should have left it where you found it." Wade showed the message to Lester. The color drained from Lester's face. He asked when the photograph had been taken. Wade zoomed in. A digital timestamp sat in the corner. It was taken 23 minutes earlier. At that moment, Wade had been sitting in Lester's living room. Someone had been inside the house. The house was supposed to be empty. Wade called his aunt immediately. She answered on the second ring. She wasn't home. She had left that morning to visit her daughter in Pittsburgh. Nobody should have been there. Wade asked whether anyone else had a key. There was a pause. Then she remembered something. A locksmith had changed the locks in 2004. But one key had never been returned. At the time, nobody thought it mattered. Wade ended the call. Lester was already gathering folders from the table. He wasn't packing everything. Only certain files. The machine shop. The pumping station. The property records. Nothing else. Wade asked why. Lester said someone had been narrowing the focus for years. Every missing document pointed toward the same places. The same dates. The same people. Then he opened a folder Wade had never seen before. Inside was a county road map from 1988. Several locations had been marked with yellow pins. Most meant nothing to Wade. One did. It was his mother's house. Another was the machine shop. A third was the pumping station. The fourth was unfamiliar. A small square building beside a rail line outside town. No label. No business name. Just a handwritten note. Storage records transferred here. Wade asked transferred from where. Lester flipped the map over. The answer was written on the back. County Records Annex. Closed November 1988. Wade frowned. The timing was too close. The annex closed less than a month after Marlene disappeared. Lester nodded. That was exactly what had caught his attention years earlier. A large number of county files were moved during the closure. Some never reappeared. Among them were property surveys, maintenance logs, inspection reports, and several folders connected to land transfers from 1988. Wade's phone buzzed again. Another message. No number attached. Only an image. This time it wasn't the sewing room. It was an old photograph. Black and white. Taken sometime in the 1970s. Several people stood in front of a building. Wade immediately recognized the building. The pumping station. He zoomed in. Near the edge of the frame stood a young woman. Not Marlene. Someone else. Pinned to her jacket was a name tag. The photograph quality was poor, but part of the name remained visible. Voss. Wade felt his pulse jump. Marlene's maiden name had been Voss. He had never heard of another relative working there. Then he noticed something stranger. A red circle had been drawn around the woman. Someone had added it recently. Beneath the image was a question. Did she ever tell you about Elaine? Wade looked up. Lester was staring at the photograph. His expression had changed. He asked Wade where he got it. Wade handed him the phone. Lester read the message twice. Then he quietly said he knew that name. Not well, but enough to remember one conversation from decades earlier. He walked to a filing cabinet. His hand hesitated before opening the drawer. Inside were dozens of folders. Most were unlabeled. He pulled one from the back. The folder contained newspaper clippings. Not about Marlene. About a workplace accident. The articles were dated 1974. The location was the pumping station. One employee resigned shortly afterward. Another transferred out of state. And a third person disappeared from all subsequent records. The name on that line was Elaine Voss. Wade read the article. The accident itself seemed minor. A brief equipment failure. A temporary shutdown. Nothing that should have remained important for 45 years. Yet someone had clipped every article about it. Every mention. Every correction. Every follow-up. As Wade turned the final page, something slid out from between the papers. A train ticket. And used. The date printed on it was October 14, 1988. The day after Marlene vanished. The departure city was Meadville. The destination was missing. The right side of the ticket had been torn away. But on the back, written in blue ink, were 6 words. Don't use the station again. Neither man spoke. Then Lester noticed something Wade hadn't. The ticket number had been partially crossed out. Not with a pen. With a county record stamp. And directly beneath the stamp was a file reference. 44B. Lester took the ticket from Wade's hand. He held it under the lamp. The stamp was faded, but the file number was clear. 44B. He opened the old cardboard folder again. This time there was a second envelope tucked beneath the property records. It had never been opened. Lester turned it over. The seal was marked with the same county stamp, but the date beside it was different. November 3, 1988. Wade asked why a file created after Marlene disappeared contained her name. Lester didn't answer. He reached for a pair of scissors, then stopped. A small handwritten note had been attached to the envelope. Return unopened. There was no signature. Wade asked who had written it. Lester said he had no idea. He placed the envelope on the table. Then his telephone rang. Neither man moved at first. The ringing continued. Lester finally answered. A man's voice asked for Wade. Wade stepped closer. The caller knew his full name. He also knew where Wade was sitting. Then he mentioned the letter. Wade took the receiver from Lester. Who is this? The line went quiet. A faint mechanical sound followed. 3 clicks. Then the call ended. Wade looked at Lester. Neither spoke. Lester disconnected the phone. Then he locked the front door. He checked the windows. Everyone was shut. But when he returned to the table, the envelope was gone. Wade stared at the empty space. Lester searched beneath the papers. Nothing. The envelope had been sitting directly between them. Neither man had moved. Then Wade noticed something on the floor. A small piece of paper. It had been torn from the envelope. Only 2 words remained visible. Room 17. Lester's face tightened. He said the room number again. This time Wade understood why. Room 17 had not been part of the machine shop. It was underneath it. A maintenance chamber listed on an old engineering plan. The chamber had been sealed in 1976. At least according to the county records. Lester went to another cabinet. He pulled out a rolled blueprint. The paper cracked as he opened it. The machine shop appeared in the center. Beneath the main floor was a rectangular chamber. Room 17. But the blueprint showed something else. A narrow passage connected the chamber to the old pumping station. Wade traced the line with his finger. The passage ran beneath the road, then beneath the railroad, and finally ended near the property Marlene had purchased. There was a second route. A service entrance behind the pumping station. Lester said that entrance had been sealed before he ever saw the building. Wade asked whether anyone could still reach it. Lester looked at the blueprint. Then he noticed a handwritten mark near the service entrance. A small X. Beside it was a date. October 13, 1988. Wade's phone vibrated again. Another photograph. This one showed a concrete doorway surrounded by weeds. The image had clearly been taken recently. Someone had painted a number above the doorway. 17. Wade enlarged the photograph. There was something on the ground near the entrance. A metal box. Half buried in the dirt. Its lid was open. Inside was a stack of papers. And on top of them was a driver's license. The photograph was too blurry to read the entire name. But the birth date was visible. October 6, 1951. Wade knew his mother's birth date. He had seen it on her old records. October 6, 1951. His hands went still. Lester took the phone from him. He zoomed in on the license. The photograph showed a woman. The face was damaged by age and distance. But the name beneath it was partially readable. Marlene Voss. Wade stared at the screen. Then another message arrived. This one contained no photograph. Only a sentence. She never made it to the train station. A second message followed before Wade could respond. But someone used her ticket. Wade read the message 3 times. Then he looked at the ticket on Lester's table. The destination had been torn away. But the ticket number was still visible. Lester picked up the phone and called the railroad archive. He gave them the number. The clerk searched the old records. There was a passenger attached to it. Not Marlene. A man had boarded the 11:58 p.m. train from Meadville on October 14, 1988. His name was Harold Venn. Wade felt his stomach drop. Harold had supposedly moved to Ohio 2 years earlier. The clerk checked the return records. Harold never returned. But there was another detail. He had purchased a second ticket at the station. Same night. Same train. Destination, Toledo. Passenger name, Elaine Voss. Wade stopped breathing for a moment. Elaine had disappeared from the records 14 years earlier. Now her name appeared beside Harold's. Lester sat down. He said nothing. Wade asked whether the railroad had any record of Marlene. The clerk searched again. There was no passenger record under her name. But there was a baggage receipt. 1 suitcase. Checked under the initials MV. Wade asked where it had been sent. The clerk gave him the destination. Toledo. The same city Harold had supposedly moved to. Wade drove there the next morning. The old station was gone. A parking structure stood where the platforms had been. But the railroad archive still had boxes from 1988. One box contained unclaimed baggage records. Wade found the receipt. Then he found the suitcase number. The suitcase had never been collected. It had remained in storage for 6 months before being auctioned. The auction buyer had been a local antiques dealer. The dealer was still alive. He remembered the suitcase. Not because of what was inside. Because of the name written on a small card tucked beneath the handle. Marlene Voss. He told Wade the suitcase contained clothing, a sewing kit, 2 children's drawings, and several envelopes. The envelopes were gone. Everything else had been discarded years earlier. Except one item. The dealer had kept a small metal key. Wade asked where it came from. The man said he never knew. It had been inside one of the envelopes. The key had a number stamped into it. 17. Wade returned to Pennsylvania. Lester was waiting at the old pumping station. The service entrance had been opened. Inside, the passage was narrow and covered with decades of dust. They followed it until they reached a concrete room beneath the machine shop. Room 17. There was no body. No suitcase. No hidden chamber. Only an old wooden desk. On top of it sat a ledger. The last entry was dated October 13, 1988. The signature belonged to Marlene. Wade turned the page. A second signature appeared underneath hers. Harold Venn. Then a third. Elaine Voss. The 3 names had been written within minutes of each other. But the ledger contained one more entry. It was dated October 14th. The signature was different. Wade recognized it immediately. It belonged to the county records clerk. Beside his signature was a single notation. Transfer completed. Wade searched the remaining pages. Most were blank. Then he reached the final page. Someone had written a sentence across the bottom. If they find this room, tell Wade his mother never left willingly. Wade's hand stopped. There was no explanation. No name. No accusation. Only those words. Lester found something beneath the desk. A second envelope. This one contained a photograph. It showed Marlene standing beside a train platform. She was alive. The date stamped on the back was October 14, 1988. One day after her disappearance. Wade stared at the photograph. Marlene wasn't alone. Harold stood several feet behind her. And beside Harold was Elaine. But the photograph had one detail nobody had expected. Marlene was holding a newspaper. The front page was visible. The headline concerned a county property investigation. The investigation had been announced that morning. Before anyone knew Marlene was missing. Wade turned the photograph over. A message had been written across the back. Your mother knew where the money went. Lester read it. Then he noticed something else. The photograph had not been taken in Toledo. The station sign in the background showed a town only 30 miles from Meadville. Wade looked at the date again. October 14th. If the photograph was genuine, Marlene had been alive after the official search began. And someone had deliberately kept that fact from investigators. Wade spent the next several months tracking every document connected to the property transfers. He found missing records. Changed signatures. Payments that had never been explained. But he never found Marlene. He also never found Elaine. Harold Venn disappeared from every public record after October 14, 1988. The county records clerk died in 2006. The retired investigator, Lester Vail, died 3 years after Wade first contacted him. Before his death, Lester gave Wade one final envelope. Inside was the original photograph from the machine shop. The same photograph that had started everything. But Lester had enlarged one section. The dark station wagon was visible. So was the person standing beside it. Wade finally saw the face clearly. It wasn't Harold. It wasn't the county clerk. It wasn't anyone he recognized. It was a woman. And hanging from her wrist was a small metal key. Number 17. Wade still doesn't know who she was. But there is one detail he discovered afterward. The woman had been photographed again. Not in 1988. In 1991. The image came from an old newspaper archive in Ohio. She was standing outside a courthouse. 3 years after Marlene disappeared. And beside her was a 9-year-old girl. The girl's name was Colleen Voss. Marlene's daughter. The photograph had been misfiled for decades. No one had connected it to the disappearance. Wade did. Because the woman was holding the same newspaper. And written across its front page was a date. October 13, 1988. The date Marlene vanished. Wade never learned where Colleen had been that day. He only knew that his sister had no memory of the photograph. And when he finally showed it to her, she stared at the woman for nearly a minute. Then she pointed to the key hanging from the woman's wrist. She said she remembered seeing it when she was 9. She remembered her mother giving it to someone. But she couldn't remember who. There was one last detail. A detail Wade found almost by accident. The original house had been demolished in 2021. During the demolition, workers found a narrow metal box sealed inside the wall behind the old sewing room. Inside was a second letter. It had been written before the first one. The date was October 9, 1988. Only one sentence was written on the page. Wade, if they tell you I left, don't believe them. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. The handwriting was Marlene's. And beneath the sentence was a number. 17. 38 years later, nobody can say for certain what happened to Marlene Voss. There is no confirmed grave. No confirmed sighting after 1988. No confession. No final record explaining the missing files. But the train ticket, the photographs, and the letters all point to one fact investigators never considered. Marlene may not have disappeared when her car was found. She may have disappeared later. And if the photograph from October 14th is genuine, then someone knew exactly where she was. Someone who was standing beside her. Someone who had the key. And someone who spent 31 years making sure nobody knew what room 17 was used for. The strangest part is that the room itself no longer exists. The machine shop was demolished in 2003. The pumping station was removed a few years later. Room 17 was filled with concrete. But Wade still has the key. He keeps it in a locked drawer. And every October 13th he takes it out. Because there is one thing he has never been able to explain. The number stamped into the key is not simply 17. There is another set of numbers beneath it. They were hidden under years of rust. When Wade finally cleaned the metal, he discovered a date. October 9, 88. The day before Marlene wrote the first letter. And the day before anyone officially knew she was in danger. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story.